In our week 3 assignment, we're going to be painting a distant ocean as viewed from atop a bluff, which is surrounded by a bunch of trees. And here in Seattle, where I live, there are a lot of nice places to go hiking that are up on bluffs or ridges or even mountains, and they overlook the ocean most of the time. And so there's this really common view that I get here. And where you live, you might not have this kind of view, but I think this will give us a little bit of insight into the basics of painting an ocean, and it will give us a lot of different ways to experiment with painting trees and leaves, and I think that's really important. And while we won't really be painting isolated trees in this painting, we'll be painting a lot of leaves at different distances. And this will really give you a lot of insight into how to paint trees later on in other paintings. So this is our kind of our main reference photo. We're going to be painting something similar to this perspective, but I have some other examples of bluffs here that we can take a look at. This is another similar kind of view here where you can kind of see the ocean in the distance and different kind of trees, but this is kind of a more standard view of trees with the trunks. This is kind of a more island kind of bluff, but you can still see there's a lot of similarities in these. The ocean's very distant, the detail's very small in the ocean because it's very far away, and the trees are very close and they kind of surround the composition. Here's another piece. You can see a lot of distance there. There's no ocean in this piece, but it gives you an idea of what land might look like. And here's yet another piece with just some land, some nice fog. And another picture from Seattle. So that gives us some idea of kind of what we're going for, and we'll look at some of these examples in more detail to make some observations that'll help us while we're painting. While the ocean's surface is far away from the observer, it still has detail and character, with ripples and streaks of varying color. Ripples and waves are accomplished by creating contrast, placing dark against light. Contrast works well for achieving movement and form in water. Avoid adding too much detail to the water because the ocean is far away in this composition. All of its details should be reduced in size to fit into perspective. Make sure to set the ocean and horizon into the background by reducing focus using blur and the blender brushes. Trees come in a wide range of shapes and sizes, but they all share some common characteristics. First of all, leaves. Leaves vary in shape and size depending on the type of the tree you're painting. From a distance, leaves converge into clumps of fractal shapes with only basic color and form. Their colors are often influenced by the sky color, and they may get lighter in value near the horizon. Closer to the foreground, leaves have clearly defined shapes and must be spaced apart to fit into perspective. The shadow values should get darker as you move closer into the foreground. Tree trunks and limbs often grow in a forking fractal pattern. The base of the trunk is often the largest section, and each branch which forks off of it reduces in diameter as it grows away from the trunk. Branches can be straight, crooked, thick, thin, and everything in between. The more character your tree has, the more real it will look. Make sure to overlap some of your branches so your tree doesn't look flat. Smaller branches tend to have more contrast than the trunk and large limbs. So in this example here, I have this tree that I've kind of partially painted in, and you can see I kind of started with a trunk, and then there's some big branches, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller as they fork off. I did a whole bunch kind of over here on this end. And I'll just do a few more real quick so we can see how that works. Starting out with kind of firm pressure, and I'm tapering off, so I'm letting up with my pen just a little bit to make these smaller branches. And you want them to overlap a little bit. They can go different directions and really kind of fork however you want. You really kind of want to stagger these branches when they fork. So I'm doing kind of a every other branch kind of thing rather than branches coming out of the same area. or the same segment of the branch. And if you want, you can use a smaller brush, like the detail oils. I was using the scratch board tool there, and you could spend forever doing this, drawing all kinds of branches. There really isn't much of a shortcut to this. You kind of have to draw all of these branches, but it's something that's fun to do and it's good practice. Tree trunks and branches are cylindrical in form and often have a distinct light side and shadow side. The shadow side can often absorb the reflected color from the sky and nearby objects like grass. Adding reflected light helps to make the tree look more cylindrical. Trunks and branches are typically shades of gray, brown, and white. Leaves and branches can cast shadows onto the tree. Use this to effect by adding dark where the light source is fully obstructed. So in this example here, our light source is off to the right, and I have this little stump here that I'm going to shade. So this is several cylinders. We're going to do the main one here. So I'm just going to add a lighter brown color to the side that's facing the light. Use a smaller brush to do that for the limbs. You don't have to shade all the limbs because some of the limbs might get less light, some might get more. Get something like that. We'll just lighten our color a little bit more. Add a little more highlight. You can add as much as you want here. And if we want to add some reflected light on the opposite side, we can sample our sky color. Dull it down just a little bit. Put some sky color on the back side. Now this is going to be kind of subtle. Might only be able to barely see this, but that's good. And we'll put in a little bit of the grass color too. We'll sample the grass color, dull it down a little, put in a little bit of the grass color. Now I'll zoom into this and we'll see if you can see it a little bit better. Now it looks a little bit more cylindrical. There's some light reflecting off of that bark. Trees have bark, which is often rough and textured. Texture is very important to achieving effective tree trunks. The texture may become more noticeable as the tree ages, so the trunk and larger limbs will have the most distinct texture. Paper textures work well, as does the sponge brush for creating rough texture. Bark often has a grain which runs vertically along the trunk and limbs. There can also be burrs and knots which can distort the grain. So we'll add some shading to our tree trunk here. I'm going to use preserve transparency here, and we'll use a sponge. And depending on which size you make your sponge, you'll get a different kind of texture. I'm going to use this size. We want to use the darkest color in our tree, or a darker color than that. And I'm just going to brush over the trunk, and we get some instant texture, as you can see there. Now, if I blend it a little bit, I can use the diffuse blur or the coarse oily blender. I can establish some sort of grain, so I'm going to paint vertically down along the tree. There we go. And sometimes the bark kind of splits with another type of grain, and that kind of swirls around the tree. So you could use something like the scratch board tool with a kind of thin diameter to kind of draw in some streaks that kind of enhance the contours of these branches. See, that really gives it character. Leaves can be many colors, but are typically shades of green, yellow, orange, brown, and red. Leaf highlights are vibrant and warmer in hue. Shadow areas are cooler in hue and less vibrant. Choosing the right green color is critical to achieving realistic trees. Make sure to vary your leaf color because not all leaves are the same. In this example of a little tree I painted here, you can see the kind of different colors of greens and yellows that I used. I used some of the sky color reflected off some of the leaves that are pointed away from the light source, and then the leaves that are closer to the light source are much warmer, and they're kind of reflecting a bit of the sun color, which really makes it look nice and realistic. If I just used a kind of monochromatic leaf color scheme, it would just look flat. It wouldn't look like it's there existing in this landscape with all these nice colors. So colors are very important to add to your leaves. It's also good to tint your leaves because trees often have dead leaves. If you use a tinting layer set to multiply, you can vary the color of your foliage to give it more character. Dead leaves lose their green hue and turn to warm shades like red, orange, yellow, and brown. Seasonal changes cause some trees to change in appearance. Leaves may change in color, size, and even disappear altogether. Trees like evergreens show very little seasonal change and remain consistent throughout the year. For fall scenes, you should use a lot of reds, yellows, and oranges. In spring and summer, use bright yellow greens. Winter scenes are often monochromatic with cool hues and muted colors. A tree's size and shape changes drastically over time. Trees live a long life, and their shape tends to get more and more exaggerated with age. Trees grow to a variety of heights, usually very tall. Distant trees may seem smaller compared to foreground trees because of perspective diminution and foreshortening. To make a foreground or midground tree look tall, place it well above the horizon line. To make it look short, place it lower on the horizon. For additional realism, add objects to the composition which establish scale when compared to the tree. For instance, here we could add a person. Just draw a little stick figure here to go along with our stick figure trees. And if our person is the same height as the observer, then their eyes will be level with the horizon line. And there we go. This tree now looks like it's this much taller than this person. And this tree is quite a bit shorter. Foliage grows in clumps, and trees are made from multiple clumps of foliage. The basic form of these clumps is spherical, cylindrical, or cone-shaped. Within each clump, each leaf has its own flat plane which faces the light at different angles. You must utilize both 3D and 2D shading principles to achieve a natural tree form. So for instance, I will pull up this shading example. Our light's coming from top left. We have our generally kind of spherical shape here, if we want to think of this as a shape, a kind of a sphere, or several spheres that are kind of clumped together. So we know where our light source is, we know what shape we want to make. We'll go ahead and grab the sponge, and just like we would shade a sphere, we're going to choose lighter colors as we move near the light source. And we have the basic gist of a tree there. We can put in some of our sky color by sampling it, dulling it down, and we can throw in a little bit of reflected sky color. Individually, leaves are 2D planes. The leaves nearest the light source will have the brightest highlights. Add a few sparse, almost white highlights to imply leaves which are facing the light source directly. Leaves which are pointed away from the light should be darker. So you can see this example I have of this tree here, where the light's hitting it. There's these nice bright little leaves that I can put on, and this really kind of gives the impression that these leaves are pointed at the light. So the light's bouncing off of these leaves. Now the leaves that are darker in the background here, they're all pointed away. They're not getting any light, so they're much darker. And as far as the hue, I'm using these kind of middle greens here for the shadows and the midtones, and then for the highlights, the hue's getting shifted towards yellow. So there's this sense of brightness and the tree being illuminated on one side. Clumps of leaves are usually denser in the center and reveal more negative space near their edges. Like in this example here, you can kind of make out these clumps. Even this tree is a whole clump, and near the edges of the clumps, you can see there's more kind of gaps in between here, all these little areas. Whereas in the center of the clumps, it's much more dense. The leaves are kind of packed together. So you don't want there to be an even mixture of gaps, and you don't want the tree to be too thick. You kind of want there to be a little bit of both, but for the most part, in the center of the tree, that's where you're going to have the most clump density. And then as you get near the edges, the clumps are going to start to break apart, and you'll start to see more individual little leaves and things. Leaves near the edge of a clump overlap less frequently, which creates a natural fractal pattern. You want to avoid using a round eraser to remove leaves because it creates smooth round holes which look unnatural. So on this foliage here, if I go to try to erase some of it using the eraser, watch what happens. I erase, but I get these really weird looking holes in the tree, and it looks like all of a sudden the tree is flat and something like a worm ate a hole in it. It doesn't look right. What you want to do is you want to create fractals. I use a mask here, and then within the mask, I use black to paint, and then I can use a number of brushes. I could use the sponge, I could use the chalk, I could use pretty much anything that creates a fractal. So let's use the chalk here. And if I paint with black, you can see I can erase leaves now, but I'm erasing in a way that looks more natural. And of course, I can erase too many, and now all of a sudden ruin the tree. But, I can do some undos and go back and just use it sparingly here and there to kind of clean up the edges a little bit, because we want to keep that clump density very dense in the center. Young leaves are often smaller in size than older leaves and reside near the edges of clumps as the limbs grow outward. Vary your leaf size when painting clumps and individual leaves to achieve natural foliage effects. So for some up-close leaves here, I'm going to have some kind of big leaves, and then towards the edge, I'm going to make them a bit smaller to get some nice effects like the leaves are kind of growing. Because if I just make them all the same size, it's just not going to look right. And you could just start doing your clumps. And basically what I do here with this particular brush is I press really hard with really firm pressure when I start making my clumps. And then when I get towards the edge of the clumps, I use lighter pressure. That makes the clumps, or the individual leaves, smaller. You also want to change your direction. You want the leaves to kind of flow off of the branches. Let's see, they get smaller as they go towards the end. And you could, of course, make your brush smaller too if that's easier. Nothing worse than making all your leaves the same size, though. You don't want to do that. You can even put in a few real big ones here and there. Now you might have a branch that maybe hangs down. And if you have a branch that hangs down, or you just have kind of a droopy tree, then you'll want to use leaf bearing, which is the direction that the leaf is kind of going, or the clumps are going. So in this example, the bearing is kind of down. So my leaves are all going to kind of hang down here off of my branches. I'm not going to really do any that point up. Maybe occasionally there might be a few that kind of stray. And again, they're getting smaller as we go towards the edge of the branch. Some trees are more vulnerable to wind than others, especially if it's really windy out. You might have a tree in your painting that you want to look like it's kind of being blown by the wind. Put some branches here, and then we could paint some leaves. And you would want your leaves to have a bearing that kind of goes to the side here, which would really give your piece the feel of there being some wind. The distance the tree is from the observer determines how a tree will be illustrated. Trees that are far away become out of focus and have little detail other than basic color and shape. As you move into the foreground, color and edge detail become more apparent. In this example here, our trees in the background are really just kind of not even really a green color at all. They've absorbed so much of the sky color that they appear to be kind of a blue-gray. They're kind of a gray-orange over here where they are closer to the light. And you can't really make out individual trees. They all kind of clump together, and the detail's very soft because they're very distant. And we have this foreground tree, which is much more distinct. We can see the leaf color and all the branches and lots of the details. And if we had a tree that was even closer, then we would see individual leaves, and you'd have to kind of illustrate each leaf on its own, let's do an example of that here. We'll do a foreground branch really quick. And if it's going to be in the foreground, it's usually going to be pretty dark in value. And for this particular piece, we're going to maybe make a kind of a little branch that comes from out of nowhere, gets kind of silhouetted. I don't want to put too much detail in it, just because it's going to be an example, but we'll give it a good number of branches here. And then we'll make a layer for our leaves, and we'll put some leaves over it. Now, because this is so close in this particular piece, I'm going to want this to have a feel of being kind of out of focus because it's so close. So the observer is kind of focusing more on the tree in the background. So we've got some nice leaves here. We'll give them, I want them hang down a little bit and then get towards the edge to kind of give it some character. Have some coming from outside here, and we want to make sure that they get smaller. Towards the edge of the clumps. Okay, so these are going to be out of focus, so what we can do is we can just use the blur brush, and for this, we'll just set this particular one to multiply. That way when we blur it, everything will be okay. And we can now blur it a little bit. It comes out of focus. Want to blur our branch as well, an equal amount. And there you go, you've got this nice out of focus branch, and you might want to just move it out of the way a little bit so it's not so distinct. This is kind of what I'm getting at with your different distances of trees. Background trees will be less detailed. Midground trees will be more detailed. You'll be able to see more of these clumps. And then the foreground trees, they don't always have to be blurry like this, but you are going to have to draw leaves as individual leaves. Otherwise, if you just do this clump thing like you would do for the midground trees, the leaves are going to look very small, and that might not be what you want. Now, you've seen me use a bunch of different brushes here, and I have different brushes for different types of leaves. You want to use these brushes to your advantage to paint several leaf shapes at once, and when possible, try to let the brushes make the leaves or the clumps for you in as few strokes as possible. This will not only save time, it'll also allow you to paint more spontaneously. So, a few of the different brushes. If we start kind of near the top, the Impressionist brush works very well. Kind of scatters these leaf shapes. This works better for midground trees and background trees. If you do it too big in the foreground, you can kind of see these rough edges, which don't work so well for leaves. But when they're very small and they're packed together, works quite well. Now, I've made some variants of this brush that work a little bit better. There's the Impressionist Leaf, which works with pen pressure, so you can get the leaves to be smaller, and they also kind of spit out randomly. You can use this in combination with some color variability to get some kind of more realistic effects. Then I have the Impressionist Leaf Small, which just spits out fewer leaves, and this is something that I use for highlights because you don't want to put on too many highlights, you just want to put on a few, so it kind of sprinkles a few leaves on very easily. The next one we will look at is the tree knife. This is pretty good for just filling in big clumps. You can draw with it, or it works really well if you just kind of tap. And this works great for midground trees. Not so well for foreground trees or background trees. You would kind of want to use this to fill in the bulk of your leaves and then go over it with another brush to kind of add some detail. A brush like the leaf knife, for instance, is a variant of one of the palette knives. And the leaf knife just kind of makes these weird, quirky little shapes, and sometimes they don't always come out like you think they're going to. They come out all twisted up. But if you figure out the right amount of pressure and the right direction to go, you get these nice leaf shapes. And what's good about this is it lets you paint more spontaneously. If you have less control, you end up with these less intentional shapes, which look more natural. So, although this brush seems a little strange, if you really just kind of go at it and you just start painting, I'm not thinking, I'm just painting. See how I'm getting this nice leaf effect? If I think about it too much and I go too slowly and I do too many leaves exactly where they should be, it doesn't look as good as if I just do it fast, like so. Now, the last thing that you can do, which will really make your work stand out and look really interesting, and it'll bring your trees together, is you can add some different little twigs and branches. And sometimes you want it to be light, sometimes you want it to be dark. You want to have a little of both, depending on where you're at and what your lighting is. I like to use the detail oils for this because it varies in opacity. And when you're doing foreground and midground twigs, you may want your brush to be a little bit thicker, but for background stuff, you want a nice thin brush like this. So I'll zoom in a bit here on this clump, and we'll draw in a few little twigs. If you do too many, you can always go through and erase some of them or conceal them. You just put in a few little branches like this, light ones in the dark areas, dark ones in the light areas. You'll get some really great effects. See, it really puts it into context now, and you know that this is a tree or a bush with all these little branches sticking out. So you want to throw these in anywhere you can, in the background, in the foreground, in the midground. Just make sure that your limbs are an appropriate size in relation to your tree. Now that we have some observations to draw from, we can go ahead and start our week 3 assignment painting.